The chill of a Polish autumn night still clung to the ground as the first gray light of dawn approached on September 19, 1939. Near the small village of Slado, on the western bank of the Bzura River, a column of several hundred men stood in a tense, weary silence. They were Polish soldiers, but their uniforms told a story of disintegration. Infantrymen from the 26th Regiment stood beside cavalry troopers from the Podolska Brigade who had lost their horses, and artillerymen from the 17th Division who had been forced to abandon their guns days earlier. Their faces were gaunt with exhaustion and streaked with soot and dirt. They were no longer a regiment or a formal battalion, they were a desperate amalgamation, a fragment of the once proud Poznan army, bound together by the singular goal of survival. Their commander, a colonel whose own unit had been shattered, peered across the sluggish water. The far side offered the faint promise of reaching the dense sanctuary of the Kampinos Forest, and from there, a desperate push to the besieged capital of Warsaw. But between them and that hope lay the Bzura, and somewhere in the tree lines and mist-shrouded fields beyond, they knew the German cordon waited. This anonymous gathering of soldiers was just one of dozens of such isolated, ad hoc groups moving through the chaos that morning. For this column, and for many others like it, the coming hours would mark the final, violent transition from a military unit to a historical mystery. After this day, no more radio signals would carry their designations, no orderly after-action report would document their final stand. They would simply vanish from the operational maps, becoming part of the enduring and somber enigma of the Lost Battalions of the Bzura Offensive, swallowed whole by the fog of war and the relentless advance of a modern war machine. Their individual fates, and the precise details of their last moments, would become subjects of painful speculation, forensic recovery, and an eternal search for closure. To understand the fate of these men waiting by the river, we must rewind to the middle of September 1939, to a Poland fighting for its very existence. The German invasion, launched on September 1st, had achieved devastating success with its blitzkrieg tactics. Polish frontier defenses had been overwhelmed, and key units were in retreat. Warsaw was under aerial siege, and from the east, a new and terrible threat was emerging. The Soviet Union was mobilizing to invade, in accordance with a secret pact with Nazi Germany. In this atmosphere of impending catastrophe, two large Polish formations found themselves in a uniquely perilous position. The Army Poznan, under General Tadeusz Kutrzyba, and the Army Pomers, under General Władysław Bortnowski, had been positioned in the west of the country. Contrary to the caricature of a hopeless Polish cavalry charge, these were substantial forces, together comprising nearly a quarter of Poland's mobilized strength. They were not frontier garrisons, they were operational armies, composed of some of the nation's best-trained divisions, many filled with reservists who were farmers, teachers, and tradesmen from the very regions they were now tasked to defend. Their strategic dilemma was acute. With the front collapsing to the east and south of them, they risked being completely cut off and encircled without ever having fired a major shot in the defense of their homeland. General Kutrzyba, a pragmatic and respected officer, faced a dire choice: retreat eastward in a disorderly fashion, likely to be harried and destroyed piecemeal, or use the concentrated force at his disposal to strike a blow. Kutrzyba chose the offensive. His plan, known to history as the Bzura Offensive, was a bold gamble born of desperation and professional duty. Beginning on the night of September 9th, the combined forces of Poznan and Pommer's armies fell upon the flank of the German 8th Army, which was driving toward Warsaw. The assault achieved complete tactical surprise. The German 30th Infantry Division was mauled, and for a few fleeting days, a sense of exhilaration swept through the Polish ranks. They were not just retreating, they were hitting back, recapturing towns like Leksika and Piatek, and threatening to disrupt the entire German operational timetable. News of the counterattack provided a crucial morale boost to the entire nation and to the defenders of Warsaw. It proved the Polish soldiers' tenacity and skill in maneuver warfare. But this success was a fragile bloom in a desert of strategic defeat. The German High Command, initially alarmed, reacted with cold, mechanized deficiency. They saw the Polish offensive not as a crisis, but as an opportunity. Instead of retreating, they began to funnel massive reinforcements toward the Bzura sector, including the formidable 1st and 4th Panzer Divisions and additional motorized infantry. The goal was no longer to contain the Polish thrust, but to encircle and annihilate both Polish armies in a gigantic battle of annihilation, a Kesselschlacht. By September 12th, the tide had decisively turned. Overwhelming German air power, the dreaded Stuka dive bombers, pounded Polish columns relentlessly, destroying supply trains and shredding troop concentrations on the open ground. German armored units began slicing into the Polish flanks. The offensive momentum stalled, then reversed. What began as a proud counter-punch was now a desperate fighting retreat. On September 15, the jaws of the German trap snapped shut at the key river crossings. Motorized elements of General Hermann Hoth's 15 Corps raced ahead to capture the towns of Sahachev and Broshow, blocking the main escape routes across the Bzura River toward Warsaw. The Poznan and Palmer's armies were now caught in a vast, shrinking pocket. In this crucible, the orderly structure of divisions and brigades began to dissolve under the pressure of constant bombardment and collapsing communication lines. It was at this moment that the High Command issued the fateful order: the armies were to break out in separate groups, to infiltrate through German lines and reach Warsaw to continue the defense. This directive, while tactically understandable, marked the genesis of the Lost Battalions. It meant that the remaining cohesive forces would now fragment into smaller, regimental-sized columns, each left to find its own path through a landscape increasingly dominated by the enemy. The men gathering near Slattle on the 19th were the direct products of this order, soldiers who had fought bravely in a grand offensive, only to find themselves abandoned by the larger tide of battle, transformed into an isolated fragment seeking salvation across a hostile river. The precise moment the Great Retreat transformed into a fragmented diaspora can be pinpointed to the afternoon of September 15, 1939. With the confirmation that German panzers held the bridges at Sahachev, the Polish High Command within the pocket recognized the grim reality: a coordinated, mass breakout by entire divisions was no longer feasible. The order went out to the embattled formations of the 14th, 17th, and 25th Infantry Divisions and the remnants of the Podolska and Wielkopolska cavalry brigades: break into smaller, more mobile groups and proceed independently toward Warsaw. The goal was no longer to hold ground, but to seep through the German cordon like water through cracks. On the ground, this directive translated into a scene of controlled chaos. Regimental commanders gathered their officers, often by lamplight in forest clearings or battered village churches, to plot individual routes using inadequate maps. The social cohesion of the Polish army, strong in its regional ties, now became a literal lifeline. Soldiers from shattered companies coalesced around any familiar officer or standard, forming ad hoc battle groups that bore little resemblance to their original table of organization. Let us follow the inferred path of one such representative group, whose fate encapsulates the experience of many. In the disintegrating 17th Infantry Division, elements of the 26th Infantry Regiment, known as the Grodzinski Rifles, found themselves alongside a handful of survivors from the division's artillery, a few cavalry scouts, and a mixed bag of stragglers from other units. They were placed under the command of a seasoned lieutenant colonel, whose name would later be listed among the missing. This column, numbering perhaps 600 men at its core, began its independent journey on the night of September 16. Their immediate objective was to cross the Bzura River north of the heavily contested Sahachev sector, where the main German strength was concentrated. They moved under the cover of darkness, abandoning all remaining heavy equipment, field kitchens, supply wagons, and the last of the artillery pieces for which they had no ammunition. What remained was a force of infantry, carrying rifles, a few light machine guns, and whatever personal supplies they could scavenge or carry. The night march was a harrowing ordeal of whispered commands, stumbled progress along muddy forest trails, and the constant, terrifying illumination of the sky as German flares popped overhead, casting long, fleeting shadows. By dawn on the 17th, the column had reached the outskirts of the village of Kampinos, near the river. The Bzura here was not a mighty barrier, but a meandering, swamp-bordered stream, its banks treacherous and open. The crossing presented a dreadful tactical dilemma. To attempt it in daylight was to invite destruction from the ever-present Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft, which Polish soldiers had grimly nicknamed the Fragments, the busybody. To wait until nightfall meant losing precious hours and risk the German infantry net tightening around them. The commander chose a risky compromise. They would cross in small, staggered groups throughout the day, using whatever scant cover the riverbank willows and undergrowth provided. It was a decision that would define their fate. The first group slipped across successfully, wading through the chest-deep, chilling water. But as the morning wore on, the movement was detected. A German motorized patrol, likely from the 4th Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion, engaged the crossing point with machine gun and mortar fire. The rear elements of the Polish column were pinned down on the western bank. In the ensuing firefight, the cohesive command of the group was severed. Those who had made it across, including the commanding officer and his staff, were now separated from a significant portion of their men. No longer a single column, they became two separate entities: Group A, east of the Bzura and pushing on, and Group B, trapped on the western side and forced to scatter into the nearby woodlands. This pattern of fracture and fragmentation was replicated a dozen times across a front of 20 miles on September 17th and 18th. Other columns faced different, yet equally devastating, obstacles. Some ran directly into the screening positions of the German 24th Infantry Division, resulting in brutal, close-quarters engagements in hamlets like Kozlo Biskupi. Others found their planned routes blocked by deliberate German inundations, fields flooded by engineers opening sluice gates, turning the already difficult terrain into an impassable morass. Communication between these scattered groups was virtually non-existent. Their field radios, where they still functioned, had a limited range and were often silenced for fear of German direction finding. Courier messengers were dispatched but rarely returned. Each group was now an isolated island in a hostile sea, navigating by rumor, the sound of distant gunfire, and the simple, desperate orientation toward the east, where Warsaw and presumed salvation lay. The Kampinos Forest, a vast primeval woodland stretching toward the Vistula, became the promised refuge for all of them, a dark green sanctuary on their crude maps. But the forest, too, was becoming a trap, as German motorized and infantry units began to establish patrol lines along its western fringes, methodically preparing to sweep the area clean. For our representative Group A, now east of the Bzura, the immediate pressure had momentarily eased, but the most dangerous phase of their journey was just beginning. The German command, aware that thousands of Polish soldiers were now loose in this labyrinth, was shifting from large-scale encirclement to the meticulous, gridded hunting of dispersed prey. For the Polish groups now east of the Bzura, the days of September 18th and 19th were a relentless test of endurance and evasion. The landscape they moved through was a patchwork of pine forest, sandy dunes, small peasant villages, and boggy marshland, terrain that offered some cover but also hindered rapid movement and provided countless ambush points. Our Group A, the contingent from the 26th Regiment that had successfully crossed the river, pressed onward with a grim determination. Their pace was slowed by exhaustion, the need for extreme caution, and the necessity of foraging for food from abandoned farms and orchards. They moved mostly at night, guided by the stars in the faint, ominous glow of artillery fire to the southeast, marking the ongoing siege of Warsaw. By the early hours of September 19th, they had reached the western edge of the great Kampinos Forest. Here, they made a fateful discovery: they were not alone. In the dim pre-dawn light, they encountered other scattered Polish fragments, a battery commander with a few dozen gunners, a dismounted cavalry squadron, another cluster of infantry from the 14th Division. This merger, while bolstering their numbers to nearly 1,000 men, also created a new, volatile command problem. Who was in charge? The senior officer present, a major from an artillery regiment, assumed command, but his authority over infantry tactics in dense woodland was untested, and the cohesion of this new, composite force was fragile at best. The major faced an agonizing decision. Intelligence, gathered from frightened local peasants, was contradictory. Some spoke of German patrols already deep within the forest. Others insisted the main routes to the Vistula, and the ferries that might carry them across to Warsaw, were still in Polish hands. The decision was made to push through the heart of the Kampinos rather than skirt its edges, hoping its trackless depths would conceal them. It was a calculated risk that would prove disastrous. The German Eighth Army's after-action reports for this period note the systematic cleansing of the Kampinos, with orders to prevent any organized Polish force from reaching the river. Units of the German 1st Panzer Division and the 10th Infantry Division were now conducting coordinated sweeps, driving eastward like beaters in a hunt. Group A, moving deeper into the forest, unknowingly marched directly into the path of one such German advance guard. The first contact came shortly after noon on the 19th near a forester's lodge called Dabrowka. A burst of German machine gun fire from a concealed position on a sandy ridge cut down the Polish point scouts. The Poles, trained for open field battle, were ill-prepared for this kind of fluid, close-range forest combat. They returned fire, but without clear sightlines or knowledge of the enemy's strength, the engagement quickly devolved into a confused, sprawling skirmish fought between the trees. This was the moment the unit ceased to function as a coherent military body. Under sustained automatic weapons and mortar fire, the ad hoc command structure collapsed. The artillery major was reportedly killed in the initial volley. With no clear chain of command, the large group splintered into ever smaller fragments. Some squads attempted to outflank the German position, only to run into secondary blocking forces. Others simply broke and ran deeper into the woods, discarding weapons and equipment in a bid for survival. The German reports from this action, clinically brief, mentioned dispersing a large enemy group of several hundred in the Kampinos near Dabrowka, inflicting heavy casualties and taking many prisoners. There is no mention of the Polish unit designation. To the German company commander filing the report, they were merely another pocket of resistance to be eliminated. For the Polish soldiers, this was the end of their organized existence. The handful who avoided death or capture that afternoon were now utterly alone, reduced to individuals or tiny groups of 2 or 3, hiding in thickets, wading through bogs, their war effectively over. Meanwhile, on the western bank of the Bzura, the fate of the other splinters, like our hypothetical Group B, was being sealed with similar finality. Trapped between the river and the advancing German infantry sweep, many of these pockets chose a last, defiant stand. One such engagement occurred that same day at the village of Slado, the very scene from our opening. A mixed force of several hundred, including the stranded elements from our narrative and other groups, made a concerted attempt to force a crossing. German positions on the eastern bank, forewarned and well supported by light artillery, raked the river with interlocking fire. Eyewitness accounts from local villagers, collected years later, describe the water turning red in the desperate attempts of soldiers to use makeshift rafts or to swim under fire. Few made it across. Most were killed in the water or on the banks, while the survivors on the western side, out of ammunition and surrounded, were forced to surrender by dusk. By nightfall on September 19th, the active, organized resistance of the cut-off Bzura formations had been extinguished. The large, identifiable columns were gone, replaced by a landscape of silent corpses, scattered prisoners, and a few terrified, hidden men. The German ring around the entire Bzura pocket was officially closed on September 20th, with the formal surrender of the remaining Polish main forces, including Generals Kuczerzyba and Bortnowski. But for the Lost Battalions that had attempted their own breakout, the end had come a day earlier, not with a formal capitulation, but with a dissolution into the trees and the mud. Their final transmissions were not radio messages, but the last echoes of rifle fire in a remote forest, a sound heard by no historian, recorded only in the memory of the land itself. The disappearance of these specific units into the chaos of the Kampinos Forest and the Bzura lowlands presents a historical puzzle not of a single vanishing act, but of 1,000 small, unrecorded endings. Why does their precise fate remain debated and often unverified? The reasons are rooted in the catastrophic nature of the defeat itself. The Polish high command structure for these armies ceased to function by September 18. No central ledger was maintained of which fragmented group took what route. From the German perspective, the priority was the efficient destruction of the pocket, not the meticulous identification of every opponent. Enemy forces were logged as remnants or disorganized groups, their captured soldiers processed into the vast, anonymous stream of over 100,000 prisoners taken in the Bzura Kesselschlacht. The fog of war was not merely metaphorical, it was an archival reality. Consequently, historians attempting to reconstruct the final hours of specific columns must act as forensic detectives, piecing together fragments from German tactical reports, Polish survivor testimonies collected decades later, and the physical evidence of the battlefield itself. This process yields not a single definitive narrative, but a set of credible, often overlapping theories. The first and most prevalent theory is that of near total annihilation in a series of forgotten, small-scale engagements. German regimental and battalion-level after-action reports for September 18th and 19th are filled with brief, matter-of-fact entries noting clashes with strong enemy infantry or resisting remnants at forest crossroads, villages, and river fords across the region. The coordinates of these actions, when plotted on a map, create a deadly mosaic that perfectly overlays the presumed escape routes toward Warsaw. Historians suggest that a column like our representative Group A likely met its end not in one grand battle, but in a succession of these sharp, brutal encounters that whittled it down to nothing. A company might be destroyed in an ambush at a clearing, a platoon captured while attempting to raid a farm for food, until finally, no organized entity remained. The final soldiers may have fought to the last cartridge in a lonely pine grove, an event too minor and localized to merit a specific entry in any German war diary, their sacrifice visible only in post-war exhumation records listing unidentified Polish remains discovered in that vicinity. A second, closely related theory proposes dissolution and diffuse capture. This narrative acknowledges that for many soldiers, the will to fight as a unit evaporated once command dissolved and the hopelessness of the situation became inescapably clear. Some accounts from German soldiers describe the surreal sight of exhausted, weaponless Polish soldiers emerging from the forest in small groups, simply giving themselves up to the nearest patrol. Other testimonies, from Polish survivors, speak of officers, recognizing the futility of further bloodshed, formally ordering their men to destroy their weapons and surrender to avoid pointless slaughter. Under this theory, the Lost Battalion did not die in battle but ceased to exist as a combat force, its individuals absorbed into the sprawling German prisoner of war system. The tragedy here is one of erasure. These men survived, but their specific unit identity was lost the moment they entered a POW cage. They were recorded merely as soldiers from the Bzura pocket, their pre-capture experiences and final actions as a collective going unremarked and unrecorded. A third theory, one that offers a thread of hope, is the infiltration theory. Some historians point to scattered evidence within the records of the Warsaw garrison that, in the days following the Bzura collapse, small, ragged groups of soldiers did indeed filter into the city's western outskirts. These men, often arriving in twos and threes, reported having been part of larger columns that were broken up. They were immediately incorporated into the ad hoc defense forces manning the capital's barricades. Their original regiments were irrelevant in the desperate context of the urban siege. They became defenders of Warsaw, full stop. While this theory suggests a form of survival and continued service, it also represents the final, complete metamorphosis of the lost unit. The battalion that crossed the Bzura on September 16 did not arrive in Warsaw. Instead, a handful of its former members did, as individuals, their shared history as a specific military formation permanently severed. Their knowledge of their comrades' fates died with them, contributing to the mystery. The most poignant evidence comes not from documents, but from the ground. Post-war exhumations and ongoing archaeological surveys in the Kampinos Forest have uncovered mass graves and scattered, shallow burials. Battlefield relics, Polish helmet fragments, rusted rifle bolts, uniform buttons, are still turned up by farmers and foresters. These silent artifacts corroborate the written accounts of fierce, scattered fighting, but they almost never carry identification. They are the physical testament to the theory of annihilation and dissolution, the material remains of soldiers who became, in the most literal sense, lost. The conflicting reports from local villagers, collected by Polish historians in the 1950s and 60s, add another layer of complexity. Some recall seeing Polish soldiers surrendering peacefully, others speak of hearing intense gunfire from the woods followed by silence. This variance in local memory perfectly mirrors the historical uncertainty. It is likely that all three theories contain elements of truth for different fragments of the same original unit. Some men were killed, some were captured, a few escaped. The central mystery of the Lost Battalion is therefore not a single unanswered question, but the collective impossibility of determining which of these individual fates belonged to which soldier, and of reconstructing the final, coherent story of the group they once composed. The unit did not vanish, it fragmented into 1,000 personal tragedies, each one subsumed by the greater catastrophe of a national defeat. The soldiers who vanished in the forest and fields between the Bzura and the Vistula were not anonymous pawns on a strategic map. They were, overwhelmingly, citizen soldiers of the Second Polish Republic. They were men like Jan, a schoolteacher from Poznan who had drilled with the reserves every summer, like Stanislaw, a farmer from Pomerania who knew every contour of his own land but was lost in the Kampinos, like Pyotr, a postal clerk from Bydgoszcz who carried letters from his comrades to be mailed if they reached Warsaw. They fought not for abstract ideologies, but for the tangible reality of their homes, their towns, and the independent Poland that had been reborn just a generation earlier. Their commitment was etched in the very decision to launch the Bzura Offensive, a choice to turn and fight against impossible odds rather than retreat into passive oblivion. The subsequent fragmentation and disappearance of their units is not a tale of cowardice or failure, but the brutal, logical conclusion of that commitment, pursued to its absolute, tragic limit. They were swallowed not by a mythical wilderness, but by the overwhelming, mechanized force of a modern total war that prized annihilation over chivalry, and efficiency over individual honor. The legacy of these lost battalions is woven into the landscape itself. Today, a traveler through the villages along the Bzura, Slado, Kamień, Warsaw, will find small, weathered stone monuments, often erected by local communities in the 1960s and 70s when official commemoration was complex under communist rule. The inscriptions are tellingly vague, to the Polish soldiers fallen in the defense of the homeland, September 1939, or simply, to the unknown hero of the Bzura. These monuments do not commemorate a specific regiment because the local people who witnessed the events often did not know the names of the units that fought and died on their doorsteps. They commemorate the sacrifice itself, the universal soldier whose identity was erased by the chaos of those final days. In the Kampinos Forest, clearings once scarred by gunfire are now quiet, marked occasionally by a simple wooden cross, maintained by foresters and scout troops. The annual commemorations held here are intimate and deeply felt, attended by the families of the missing, by military historians, and by a Polish nation that has long understood that its history is written as much in loss as in victory. The broader historical significance of their sacrifice, and that of the entire Bzura Offensive, has been reevaluated by historians. While it did not alter the inevitable outcome of the September campaign, it forced a significant disruption upon the German war machine. The diversion of major armored and air units to contain the Polish counterattack delayed the final assault on Warsaw by a critical week to 10 days, allowing the capital to organize its defenses and symbolically standing as a rebuttal to the myth of a blitzkrieg that met no resistance. In a strategic sense, the Lost Battalions were the cost of that delay. Their doomed breakout attempts pinned down German forces that might otherwise have been deployed eastward, buying fragments of time at the cost of their own destruction. They demonstrated that the Polish army, though outmatched, could execute complex operational maneuvers and fight with a tenacity that surprised and cost the invader dearly. To remember these men is to confront a particular form of historical silence. Their story lacks the clear narrative arc of a last stand like Westerplatte or the symbolic defiance of the Warsaw Uprising. Instead, it is a story of dissipation, of a coherent force gradually breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces until only individual human beings remain, facing their fate alone or in small, terrified groups. This is perhaps why their story resonates so deeply. It reflects the fundamental human experience of catastrophic events. The grand structures of army and nation fall away, and what is left is the individual, the small band of comrades, and the choices made in utter isolation. The search for their specific fates, undertaken by archivists, archaeologists, and families, is a search for reconciliation with that silence, an attempt to return names to the unnamed and restore a chapter to a history that was violently interrupted. The emotional conclusion of this story lies not in solving the mystery, but in honoring its enduring weight. The Lost Battalions of the Bzura did not simply disappear, they passed into the soil of Poland, into the collective memory of a nation that has repeatedly had to fight for its right to remember. Their ultimate legacy is a testament to the price of resistance in the face of certain defeat. They affirm that valor is not solely the province of the victor, but can exist with profound purity in the act of persistence itself, even when that path leads into a forest from which there is no return. To stand by one of those simple monuments in a Polish village today is to stand at a threshold between history and memory, where the known facts of campaigns and casualty lists give way to the echo of individual lives, choices, and sacrifices. It is here that we remember them not as a lost unit, but as men who, for a brief and shining moment amid the collapse, seized the initiative, and who, in their final, fragmented hours, embodied the tragic, unyielding spirit of a homeland that refused, and still refuses, to be erased from the map of the world or the heart of its people.